Hello, and welcome to another episode of Solipsist Watched. I'm your host, the Social Solipsist, and this week I watched The Hound of the Baskervilles from 1939. Now, I think we've talked about Sherlock Holmes maybe at least once, maybe on a couple of occasions, in reference to sort of the origin of the let's say Western mystery genre and how it relates to a lot of the things like the Agatha Christie adaptations that I've watched on this channel. Sherlock Holmes is an interesting figure literarily, and Arthur Conan Doyle as an author is an interesting discussion on his own. And the way that these stories were released and how they were like serialized in like magazines or like you'd get a chapter at a time and how those things were released is kind of interesting. For those who are unfamiliar with sort of the history, the meta history, the history of Sherlock Holmes, the Hound of the Baskervilles is a weird one for a couple of reasons. For one, not all the Sherlock Holmes stories are novels. This one is. It's substantially longer than most of the rest of the stories. It is a more complex mystery than some of the others, and it is widely regarded as one of the better ones. I don't particularly remember it very well. In fact, I'm not sure I've ever actually read it all the way through. When I was younger, I read through a lot of the stories, but I'm not sure I finished this one. And so I don't have the best reference point for this. However, I went through and skimmed some summary just to sort of compare it to the film context, especially because I felt like I needed a refresher due to some more modern adaptations that have been a problem. Another thing about this film and about the book that it's based on is it's worth noting this was the first story with Sherlock Holmes that Arthur Conan Doyle had released in I think like 8 years. The preceding book or the preceding story was supposed to be the death of Sherlock Holmes. It's implied at least that he gets into a fight and disappears. Spoilers: they fall. He gets in a scuffle and they fall over a waterfall and they disappear, and he's presumed dead. And in a way, this was the author just kind of killing the character because he was tired of writing him and tired of his popularity and wanted to, go on and do something else. But there was such an outpouring of I don't want to say support, but demand for more Sherlock Holmes stories that he was convinced at some point to, probably by money, I don't know all the details, to come back and write some more stories. And so this is the first story that was released about him in quite a long time. And they don't really address the issue directly very much, that he just sort of disappeared. At the beginning of the story, he's just there, and being his normal Sherlock Holmesian self. However, it does affect the structure of the book, because he is Sherlock Holmes, despite he's not the title character, literally speaking, but he is still the focus, ostensibly the focus of the story and why a lot of people are there. But he is not that present in the story, at least for a substantial part of it. The first solid chunk of the story, he basically, he's there for one scene and then not present at all. And the reason this is relevant, I think, here is because this is the first movie made in a very long series of movies, I think like 16 of them, with this casting with Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes. Um, the it's a weird place to start because as well known as the Hound of the Baskervilles story was and probably would have been identifiable as a Sherlock Holmes story, it is and as well liked as it is now. I don't know what its status was at the time or necessarily what the audience, the prospective audience, might have thought of his presence or absence in the story. Especially as an established, if they had the intention, which I have to assume they did, of establishing characters of Holmes and Watson for continued cinematic releases, it's a little bit of a rough place to do the equivalent of like a superhero origin story. When you're making this is a story where not only is Sherlock Holmes already supposed to be a very established character, but he's substantially absent from the film. In fact, he's even more absent in the film than he is in the novel. And because this is a longer form story as well, it struggles a little bit more in the adaptation. The I don't think this is an unfaithful retelling, but it is substantially changed in a great many ways. There are a number of subplots that are eliminated entirely, characters that are changed in order to just reduce the number of different mysterious threads that are being followed. Some characters have dramatically changed in age in order to give a certain I'm assuming here, to give a certain kind of impression that is not the case in the book. Like the doctor, for example, is substantially older. And it comes together pretty well. But as a Sherlock Holmes adaptation, it's odd how many things have been changed. Now, I think this is the same problem I talked about with the Poirot adaptations, that there's only so much you can contain in a movie that is however long. In this case, it's only 80 minutes. So they have to be fairly judicious with their time. And to its credit, the movie does do a pretty good job of keeping the tone and the pacing up so that you don't get confused or overwhelmed, but you also don't get too bored. That said, I think the structural changes that were made seem to point towards, unsurprisingly, making this a more palatable story for a more mass market audience, one that isn't necessarily there for tons of different intertwining threads of intrigue. For the 1930s, the movies are still a slowly growing industry. They are not prestige art. They are kind of looked down upon, and trying to get some just meaningful stories for pop consumption is and was sort of, or was the name of the game at the time, in a lot of different ways. So I can understand a lot of the adaptation changes that were made. As far as the actual production of the film goes, I already mentioned Basil Rathbone as Sherlock Holmes, who I think does a very good Holmes. He's sort of inoffensive. He puts on the Holmesian sort of affect without feeling like he's hamming it up. But it's also a little hard to judge again because he's substantially absent from the film. There's an element of Holmes that I think most adaptations of Holmes miss, which is that he's kind of a dick. However, to that point, something I forgot to mention earlier, one of the worst things I've ever watched on TV is the Hound of the Baskervilles episode of Sherlock, the one with the TV show on that was on the BBC for a while, about 10 years ago, I want to say, with Benedict Cumberbatch. The Hound of the Baskervilles episode is one of the worst I've ever seen. It's genuinely terrible, has almost no relation to the original story whatsoever. That whole show is a shit show, and I'm not going to tear into it right now. But that that show is terrible, pretty much top to bottom, and that episode in particular is just so much worse. Um, that is one of the only adaptations that actually shows Holmes as being kind of an asshole that people appreciate, but aren't always get a little frustrated with. But that show puts it on to a degree where he just becomes unlikable and terrible. So, as far as Basil Rathbone's portrayal, who I should also mention, I think we saw in Robin Hood. It is interesting to see him as a character. I've seen the actor in a few things, I think. And like he typically plays villainous characters, as like in Robin Hood. So to see him here in a more protagonist role is interesting and nice to see. I don't know the extent of his acting chops. The casting of Watson is a little bit of an odd one. He's played by Nigel Bruce, who is a well-known actor with a long history, and he's very sort of bumbling fatherly, which is not typically how Watson is portrayed, either in the original texts or otherwise. But I don't hate it. The problem, I think, comes in the fact that, again, this is the Hound of the Baskervilles, and a substantial amount of that story has Watson as our lead. And when he's being played by sort of a chubby, bumbling, slightly silly character, or slightly silly personality, he becomes less compelling to follow. You become a little bit more worried for his safety than you do engaged in his investigation. And this is a story where Watson does investigation. It's more like sort of showing what Watson has learned over all his time with Holmes and his capacity, that he's nowhere near Holmes but still has the capacity to do investigations of his own. And I would have liked to see a Watson that's he feels too much like a sidekick, and with this being the first movie, you can't have your sidekick character be super sidekicky and still ask us to follow him. It's just a little weird. That said, I don't think it's a bad casting, and something tells me that in the following movies where Holmes is probably presumably mostly the centerpiece, that he plays off of Basil Rathbone's Holmes very well in this movie, and I think he would in one of the narratives that is more focused on that. As far as the production itself, I think the script is pretty good. Again, it's been pared down to be more approachable. And I think production-wise, like I said, the pacing is pretty good. Because it's only 80 minutes, it is even tighter than usual. Well, not necessarily for the era, but to our minds, it is a relatively short film. And so they do have to squeeze in some amount of contrivances that don't necessarily feel like discoveries. There are a lot of convenient things that come up in order to allow the story to progress, to have people be a little bit less smart, a little bit less conniving, a little bit more obvious in their actions, because the story needs to keep moving. And I think to that end, it's successful. It doesn't feel too contrived. There are some moments of just like, man, you guys aren't keeping these secrets very well, but none of it is so overt that you're like rolling your eyes at it or it seems particularly cheesy. Um, the visuals on display, I think, deserve a lot of credit. They're not all extraordinary, but this is a black and white film, and as I always talk about with black and white, you can definitely take some pretty middling cinematography with black and white if you're not particularly well versed in what you're doing, or you are more there for the storytelling than you are for the visual medium. Um, this is directed by Stanley Landfield, who I believe is a pretty well known director. I don't really know his background all that much, but he has a reputation, and I think the use especially of light and darkness in what amounts to sort of a this is less of a mystery and more like a gothic horror novel. Um, and I think that tone comes through pretty well, to the point of even having some like use of cinematography and use of light and darkness that is sort of reminiscent of like German expressionism, and some of the like overplayed, or sorry, not overplayed, but upplayed. What's the phrase I'm looking for? They really exaggerate some of the visuals in some respects in order to give you a certain feeling, and I think it works really well. I actually would have liked to see them do that more. There are some scenes where I was like, this is gloomy, but it could be gloomier, or this tone is still a little too light. They could have gone a little darker. Like narratively, could have used the visuals to give off a more sinister vibe here or something like that. But nothing stands out to me as problematic or uninteresting. So visually, I think it's pretty excellent, especially for the era. Um, the the one complaint I do think I have, like the rest of the casting is pretty good. I think the characters mostly are not that deep, but like reasonably compelling, and unfortunately, a lot of them have been, like I said, dramatically changed, so they don't have quite as much depth. I think there's maybe one or two performances that I'm like, it's fine, and the rest I think are pretty excellent. Um, but the unfortunately it culminates in an ending that is narratively the same, like it reaches the same conclusions as the ending of the novel, but it does it in a very different way, and some of that is because of the simplifications that needed to be done, but it also it does take sort of a wild revealing turn towards the end, and strays into that area that I've talked about before of a mystery story where the reveal is the audience doesn't have enough information necessarily to make a conclusive decision prior to the ending. The ending kind of slips in out of nowhere when pacing wise it maybe could have used a little bit more breathing room, and I'm sure this is a limitation of the medium at the time, and how long they were willing to make the movies. But it's just the ending's a little bit rough around the edges. It's also sort of a surprisingly happy ending. I hesitate to say happy, but positively framed. And it probably shouldn't be quite that happy. Um, I think the rest of the production is really pretty solid. Some of the costumes could have used, because it's in black and white, could have used a little bit more variability in order to, because the costumes are important to the story and to the mystery at a couple of times. Um, Having a little bit more standout costuming would have been nice, but it's also it's an imperfect science trying to imagine what costumes look like in black and white before you have developed the film. And because of the technologies of the era, you're not seeing, daily film strips from the stuff you recorded that day. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. I think this movie's pretty good. I like the adaptation. I think it's honorable to, if not entirely accurate to the original content. I like most of the casting, and I definitely think I'm going to try and watch some of the other ones with this casting with Basil Rathbone, etc. It's a solid film, and it does not betray its age. Although one quirk of the version that I watched is it's pretty obvious that the audio was pulled from records, which was typical, I think, at that time. That you'd have the film and then you'd have the audio played on records and broadcast into the cinema at the same time. It wasn't like audio embedded in film strips like it is these days. And there are some artifacts in the audio that make it pretty obvious that it was on records. Just a weird thing, and something I haven't necessarily noticed in some of the other old films that we've watched. And I wonder if it's a matter of trying to preserve a certain effect, or if they just never decided to clean these up. They are not the easiest thing to watch or to get a hold of to watch. So anyway, I'm rambling on at this point. Thank you guys for watching another episode of Solipsist Watched. If you've ever seen these before, or you've got any reflections on the contents of the video, please, of course, let me know. And I'll see you guys next time.